From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
On Election Day, you would have whole operations designed around getting ballots into the box. They would take vans around town. They would sometimes incentivize people to come out and vote. It wasn't about an informed, enthusiastic electorate. It was about just like a machine operation getting people to the polls.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Mollie Hemingway, Senior Journalism Fellow at Hillsdale College, also contributor at Fox News. Mollie joins us today to talk about a piece she co-wrote with her husband, Mark Hemingway, over at The American Mind, titled Unrigging Our Elections. Mollie, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here with you.
Always a pleasure. We talk this time about a piece that you wrote along with your husband, Mark Hemingway, at The American Mind, so americanmind.org. Unrigging our elections. Republicans need a serious counteroffensive if they want to stand a chance. Mark has done a lot of work on this over the years. You wrote a book, Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. So two great people to hear from on this subject. Right near the beginning, Mollie, you make this delineation, which I think is super important, between Election Day, which we've had for centuries now in the country, and what's turned into election season, which lasts a couple of months, and early voting and ballots being flooded all over the place. What is the difference people should understand between how we approach election day and what has now turned into election season?
It's a really important distinction that's for people to make. I think for many decades, we were used to elections in which different candidates would run, they would make their case, and it was all premised on building up enough excitement and enthusiasm and commitment to get more voters to the polling location on election day. So enthusiasm was actually like a key part of this, of determining who would win. And election season takes enthusiasm completely out of the mix for the most part. Election season enables people to vote for weeks, or in some cases months, and to have all that architecture of outside party groups or other groups who are helping people vote running for a whole season of time. And it doesn't really matter, who the candidate is, what the message of the campaign is. What really matters is how many ballots you get into the ballot box. I'm not saying it's a good thing. In fact, I think it's a very bad thing, but that's just the reality. We now have election season, and it's about ballots rather than actual enthusiastic voters.
This contrast between the enthusiasm and rallies, and I think back to the Romney election where people said, well, Romney's got these great rallies, he's going to win. It didn't happen. But contrasting that to what you describe about these weeks of voting, and it sounds like such a grind. People have to work at this. There is a dedication and a planning that needs to go into this to execute what is needed to win now in election season. It is not merely about candidate quality, which people were very concerned about this last cycle, but more about identifying where these ballots are and getting them returned. There's more strategy. There's more of a grind to this effort.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of weird how people talked about candidate quality as a major issue in 2022, which was a year that saw Fetterman win the Senate in Pennsylvania. You had Joe Biden win the presidency in 2020. Even just Katie Hobbs, not a good candidate in Arizona, and yet she won that. I think if you take Fetterman, for example, the quality of his candidacy, the quality of him as a candidate clearly was not in play for why he won Pennsylvania. He is someone who suffered a stroke early on in the campaign season, was unable to debate coherently, is unable to really speak coherently, was not really a functioning part of his campaign, and yet he won a Senate seat in Pennsylvania. There are a lot of theories as to why that is, but I think it makes sense to understand that we are in these ballot operations. It's not just about the lack of enthusiasm is no barrier to someone being elected. The lack of informed voters doesn't matter. Informed voters is something we used to care about. That's just something that doesn't matter anymore. And I want to kind of remind people that we've always had a little bit of machine operations in elections. So if you think about how we know elections were run in New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago or Detroit, some of these big, usually union heavy cities, on election day, you would have whole operations designed around getting ballots into the box. They would take vans around town. They would sometimes incentivize people to come out and vote. It wasn't about an informed, enthusiastic electorate. It was about just like a machine operation getting people to the polls. What an election season enables is for that kind of operation to be run around the clock for weeks, if not months on end, where money is not going to limit anything because people have all the money and the resources that they need if they apply them to that. So it's kind of thinking about machine operations like the kind you saw in Philly or Detroit and how they are being applied nationwide.
Mollie Hemingway with us, Unrigging Our Elections, her piece at AmericanMind.org. When we talk about these efforts to find ballots and return them, ballot harvesting is a term that's used in connection with this. There are some places in which it's legal, illegal. There are some states in which there are certain activities that are legal, illegal. What should we generally know about what can be done and what can't be done in these new weeks leading up to Election Day?
Well, the most important thing is for everybody to understand that each state has its own rules and regulations, and you should become very familiar with them. There's actually a bright side to all of the election chaos that we've had in recent years, which is you've had voters become much more aware of the need to understand how elections are run, what the processes are. That's a good thing. If you want to have free and fair elections, you need to have transparent process for everybody to know about. And because of all the problems in the 2020 election, a lot of states have changed or locked up kind of the security of their systems so that you can't have outside groups financing and running a takeover of government election offices using like big billionaire outside money. But it's so different in each state. There's no like one overarching rule. But I also want to say that I think a lot of people, when they think about this, if they're not involved in the election integrity space or, this type of get out the vote operation space, they can get discouraged and despair, and they can think that there's no, that it doesn't matter who you vote for because they've got everything under control and whatnot. But it's worth remembering that even in 2020, that was an election that had so many problems in how elections were run in different states and whether, things were handled legally or illegally or properly or improperly. And it still came down to only 40,000 votes across 3 states. If you are a Republican and you're despairing about how much Democrats are playing in this space and how little Republicans are playing in this space, keep in mind, Republicans don't need to be as good as Democrats to be competitive here. They could be just a tiny fraction as good at ballot harvesting or, some of this type of election, ballot operations as Democrats are, and be completely in the game again. Because even with all that Democrats were doing in 2020, it still was a very, very, very close election. And now you've got literally millions of Republicans starting to play in this space, and that should make it more competitive.
On the details of the counteroffensive you lay out, there's discussion about mail-in balloting and how for many years, even Democrats like Jimmy Carter would say, look, there's a potential for fraud, manipulation in mail-in balloting. It is so ingrained at this point in the way we conduct our elections, it will be tough to eliminate, at least any time in the near future. Is there any upside or benefit for Republicans to keep talking about mail-in balloting in that manner, and in essence, discouraging people from voting in that way?
There's a lot of debate on this, and I don't pick one side or the other, but there are people who say, we all know that mail-in balloting is less secure and that there are all sorts of problems with it, but polls show that voters overwhelmingly support mail-in balloting or early voting. And so since it's here, you just have to compete in that space. And then there are other people who say that you should never give up the fight on whether elections are secure or have integrity. And that since mail-in balloting and, widespread early voting type systems are so prone to problems that you have to keep fighting on that. There's probably a little bit of both that's true there, meaning you don't want to pretend like something's okay that's not okay. And there, in addition to the security problems associated with unsupervised voting, which is really what, mail-in balloting is like, pretty unsupervised voting, which is generally something we'd moved away from over the course of hundreds of years. There's also just like some cultural issues in play. When I wrote the book Rigged, I interviewed Attorney General Barr, and he had this point that I thought was a really good point about how having long election seasons is like having a jury trial where you tell each juror that they can come to a decision at any point in the trial.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying that there's something healthy about a whole society, going through a campaign together, voting on the same day, more or less, and then having the decision revealed within hours, not weeks or months, as we have seen happen. So I'm not, the reality is mail-in voting is here and is probably going to be here for a long time until or unless people come to see it as being too many problems versus the benefits. But it's good for people to advocate for a better system.
Mollie Hemingway with us, her piece at AmericanMind.org, Unrigging Our Elections, written along with Mark Hemingway. There is an entity called the Electronic Registration Information Center, which ostensibly has a very simple task, which is allowing states to share voter registration data, which sounds like a decent idea. How did even something like this get fouled up?
So the ERIC system was designed actually as a voter cleanup, like a voter roll cleanup effort. Mm-hmm. Something like 10% of the country moves each year. People can be registered in multiple states. They certainly get registered in multiple locations, within a state. But it's kind of hard to know if people are registered elsewhere. And so the idea was sold to various states, and there are more than 20 that were part of this, saying, we'll help you clean up your voter rolls. In practice, though, it turned out that ERIC was started by a very prominent left-wing activist who has a history of, doing things that support the Democrat Party, and that even though it was billed as a voter roll cleanup thing, it was more about voter roll expansion to some of these uninformed voters, or just, it was about creating many more people on voter rolls, then letting outside groups participate in get out the vote operations to help turn those, possibly completely uninformed or mostly uninformed voters into Democrat ballot harvesting operations. And so once people kind of realized that the data that states were giving was being utilized by third parties and they didn't really know about it, that's how people realized the whole reason we were in this was to clean up our voter rolls and not have bloated lists that could be exploited by bad actors. And instead, it seems like, it was moving in the opposite direction. So a bunch of states have actually exited the ERIC system, and they're looking for other ways to clean up their voter lists that aren't so prone to some of the security breaches that are being alleged here.
I don't know if you coined this phrase necessarily, the disinformation industrial complex, which regards the media and politicians and the lies being told and the way they're filtered out to the public. You say the disinformation industrial complex is literally an existential threat, not just to fair elections, but to the country itself. At least on the first part of that, the fair election part of this, we talk about Republicans, conservatives, those on the right, finding their sources of information in different places, not through the legacy media, the mainstream media. But that doesn't keep millions of people from still getting their information and data and news from those places. This is almost, I want to say it's a larger fight than what is happening in the ballot box that you lay out through most of this piece. But how do we begin to this uphill fight against the disinformation industrial complex? Yeah,
so disinformation is a term used by left-wing activists usually to describe information that they disagree with. It would be facts or opinion that is different than what they wish people were consuming. So they label it as disinformation, and then they work with powerful actors to violate people's First Amendment rights in terms of their ability to publish or discuss or receive that information. And it is Massive. It is a massive issue. We think about all the problems that we've had with corporate media going back decades where they shade the truth on different stories. And then in recent years, they've just become sort of outright propagandists where they're making up news about people they don't like. They're suppressing news and information about people that they want to be elected. A great example of this, but it's really only one example out of thousands, would be how they suppressed news and information about the Biden family business in the 2020 election, a level of election interference that is so beyond anything else that's been alleged in recent years from foreign actors or otherwise. And what's really dangerous about this is we've got the government working with big tech and corporate media to suppress this discussion of important topics for the American people. It is, you think about our country and how our whole, beginning is based on this idea that people should be free to discover the truth. The First Amendment relates to this in multiple ways, whether it's about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. It's all about this idea that people need to be free to seek and learn the truth. And when you have the government and these big agencies and big tech companies conspiring against the American people, it's a huge threat to the republic itself. All the founding fathers talked about this, and why it's such great news that in Missouri versus Biden, this really big case against government censorship, a federal judge has issued an injunction against the federal government from participating in that disinformation industrial complex. And the government appealed that stay, but it was overturned, or it continued on. So the government is currently enjoined against participation in the complex.
It seems more and more often, Mollie, at various media outlets, we've talked for a long time about media bias being as much what is not covered as what is covered, the decision about what not to cover, to have a story on. It seems more and more it is not just the stories, but the information itself. The media outlet deciding what information it will hide from the public, despite it being factual, despite it being real, because they're concerned about the way the public will interpret it. This is a relatively new line of thinking, I think.
Right. We've always had problems with how the media shade the truth and what they choose to cover and what they don't cover. The way they have ramped it up now is, I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but it's an incredibly serious situation for the country. It affects every single issue out there. Every single one, whether it's how we talk about the facts of what we know about transgenderism or abortion or election integrity or foreign policy or what's going on with the powerful people in Washington, both, who you support and who you oppose. There's not one issue on which we can trust that our corporate media and big tech and their government co-conspirators are allowing news and information just to be put out there and processed in a fair and independent way. And on the election integrity front, the U.S. says that if you are in a system where you do not have a free and fair press, where you have a propaganda press, you can't have free and fair elections. And our media have been not great for a long time, but what they're doing now is so bad that people are not truly informed about the issues that are affecting them and the level of, not just bias, but it really is propaganda that we're getting about everything from foreign policy to domestic policy, cultural issues, financial issues, everything.
Mollie, you and Mark right near the end. The GOP has to enlist ordinary voters in campaigns to effect policy changes at the local level, federal level, to ensure fair elections and open debate. A lot of that sounds an awful lot like the Tea Party movement, getting ordinary voters involved in ways that affect elections and policy. That's nearly, if you can believe it, 15 years ago at this point. What did we learn? What lessons can we take or tactics that were used that perhaps can be utilized in this new fight?
Well, anytime you have a large scale public interest in improving systems, it's a good thing. And the Tea Party was a great example of that. It's actually such a beautiful and rare example of large populist movements because it was like possibly one of the only ones that actually cared about constitutional governance. Mm-hmm. I think the Tea Party movement was very poorly handled. It was like a gift from the political gods to the conservative movement. And unfortunately, I don't think it was received as such by the Republican Party or other entities. But people should not despair. Again, good things happen when good people work toward improvements in systems. We've frequently had problems with our election system, and people don't despair. They just get to the work of improving it. I wrote about this in the book, but for like 40 years, the Republican Party was enjoined against actually doing election day oversight by a crazy left-wing federal judge out of New Jersey. And they were finally released from being under this in 2018. And since then, they've actually done some pretty impressive stuff. They've put together organizations and they've educated voters, and there are lots of outside groups that are working on election integrity issues. And there's no shortcut here. You just have to learn what the rules are, work to improve them, see how you can play within those rules, and just get about the business of doing the work. Talking about it or complaining about it doesn't do it. You actually have to get down there and make sure you're playing the election season game, if that's the game that of what the rules are in the state that you're in, making sure that you are getting out as many voters as you can for your side, and caring about whether the rules that are in place are being followed and whether those rules can be improved.
Mollie Hemingway is editor-in-chief of the Federalist. She's a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College and a Fox News contributor. This piece we've been discussing is at AmericanMind.org. Mollie Hemingway and Mark Hemingway writing Unrigging Our Elections. Mollie Hemingway, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you.
Up next, we hear excerpts from Bishop Robert Barron's 2023 commencement address at Hillsdale College. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Available now, renowned psychologist Jordan Peterson joins Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn on the latest episode of The Larry Arnn Show.
Predict the future for me a little bit. It seems to me things are coming to a point. Do you think so?
Yeah, well, I think things have always been coming to a point, but they're coming to a point way faster. Well, we have Moore's Law, right? Computing power doubles every 18 months. It's like, no, you don't understand. Computing power doubles every 18 months. We're now at the point in the course of technological progress where those doublings are happening multiple times within the span of a single life. And that means the ancient archetypal battles are accelerating.
Listen to this exclusive interview with Jordan Peterson right now. Only available on The Larry Arnn Show. Find it on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. And subscribe to receive new episodes delivered right to your device. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Now we hear excerpts from Hillsdale College's 2023 commencement address given by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron is Bishop of the Diocese of Winona-Rochester in Minnesota. He's also the founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He begins by talking about Hillsdale's foundation in abolition and the foundational truths taught at the college.
Your founders were on the right side of the most compelling moral debate of the 19th century, and it's worth remarking that the leadership of the college today finds itself on the right side of the most pressing ethical argument of our time, namely the protection of the unborn. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became the most eloquent advocate for abolition in the 19th century, spoke here, as you know, in 1863, just after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the course of his lecture, which was entitled Popular Error and Unpopular Truth, he remarked, and I'm quoting, "There's no such thing as new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth is as old as the universe," close quote. At the heart of the curriculum at Hillsdale College is a presentation of those truths, epistemic, moral, and aesthetic, that are indeed as old as the universe. These permanent things that participate in the eternity of God.
Bishop Barron asks our Hillsdale graduates and those in attendance, what kind of person do you want to be? One of the fundamental questions of life.
Now, what I want to do in very brief compass in this commencement address is to examine just one of those truths, the articulation of which occurs over and again in the great Western intellectual tradition. It's accessed typically by means of a question, not the question of what we are to do, as important as that is, but rather what kind of person we ought to be. Do we hunger and thirst for righteousness, or do we seek our own advantage? In a way, and I'll say it especially to the graduates, there's no question in the moral and spiritual order more fundamental than that. Now, a locus classicus for the entertainment of this question is in Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias. Gorgias and his friends, Polus and Callicles, are sophists, which is to say experts in teaching the art of persuasive speech. Their concern is not being truthful or just, but rather in instructing students how to speak in such a way that they appear truthful and just, and hence become convincing to others. Such professors were obviously enough enormously useful to prospective lawyers and politicians in ancient Greece, and it should be equally obvious that their intellectual descendants are rather thick on the ground today. Now, Socrates counters the sophists along these lines. If a rhetorician teaches a politician to do what in fact is unjust, he does that man and his city far more harm than good. But Polus answers by means of a taunt. Wouldn't Socrates leap at the opportunity of having power over life and death? No, says the philosopher in response, for to put someone to death unjustly is in fact no power at all. And it is at this point that Socrates enunciates one of his most enduring teachings, representing a watershed in the moral consciousness of the West. It is better, he says, to suffer wrongdoing than to do wrong oneself. It's better to suffer wrongdoing than to do wrong oneself.
We're listening to excerpts from Hillsdale College's 2023 commencement address given by Bishop Robert Barron. The bishop then asks the foundational question to our audience, what kind of soul will you have?
So, there's the question, young brothers and sisters, my fellow graduates today. What kind of soul will you have? What kind of person will you be? Will you do whatever it takes to get what you want? Or will you accept even great suffering in order to do what is right? Everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question. The Bible gets at this very same issue, but it does so not so much through philosophical argumentation as through the prophetic language of idolatry and right worship. For the biblical authors, it's never a question of religion versus secularism. First of all, they were not trading what we call religion. And secondly, they knew that there really is no pure secularism. Rather, they understood that the world is basically divided between those who worship the true God and those who indulge in idolatry or false worship. Even in our supposedly secular society, we can appreciate the appropriateness of the biblical terminology. For everyone, even the most secular, the most unchurched, operates under the aegis of something he or she considers supreme, some summum bonum, some highest good. No one would in fact get out of bed in the morning unless he believed in some value that's ultimately motivating his actions and decisions. Now, this might be bodily pleasure or fame or material goods or one's country or one's family, but if it's functioning as the prime mover of a person's activity, it's playing the role of God and is being effectively worshiped. So, the biblical form of the question that we've been considering is, whom or what do you worship? What's the highest value for you? Again, graduates, everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question.
Bishop Barron continues by telling us what's needed in order to live properly.
My intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, said that if we want to live a happy life, We should love what Jesus loved on the cross and despise what Jesus despised on the cross. Now, what did he despise? But all those objects of false worship to which we tend to erect altars. Many of us worship wealth, but on the cross he was utterly poor, stripped naked. Many of us worship pleasure, but on the cross he was at the limit of suffering, both physical and psychological. Many of us worship power, but on the cross he was nailed in place, unable even to move. Many of us worship honor, but on that terrible cross, he was the object of scorn and ridicule. In short, the crucified Lord said no as radically as possible to the idols. And what did he love on the cross? He loved doing the will of his Father. And therefore, the cross functioned as the altar on which the sacrifice of his life to the Father took place, and that's why the fire fell.
Bishop Robert Barron concludes his 2023 commencement address by encouraging everyone to become the person that God intended you to be.
St. John Paul II, in his writings on the moral life, observed that in every particular ethical choice a person makes, he's doing two things simultaneously. He's performing a moral act with definite consequences, and at the same time, he's making his own character, crafting little by little the person he's becoming. I have the confident hope, graduates, that your years at Hillsdale College have prepared you above all to shape your characters, to become the kind of persons who would endure justice rather than commit injustice, who would never dream of worshiping at the altar of an idol, and who wouldn't surrender the integrity of your souls for the whole world. And if you become the persons God intends you to be, you will succeed in lighting a fire upon the earth. God bless you all. Thank you.
That's Bishop Robert Barron, founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and Bishop of the Diocese of Winona-Rochester in Minnesota, delivering the 2023 Hillsdale College Commencement Address. You can find the full address on our YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com, search for Hillsdale College. Up next, Ben Whalen from Hillsdale's English Department introduces us to Christopher Marlowe. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Have you ever been fascinated by the stories of the earliest Christians, wondering how they worshipped and prayed, faced persecution and hardship, and settled theological disputes? It can be daunting to figure out how to proceed beyond reading the New Testament and some of the stories of early Christian martyrs. The result is a significant gap in most people's understanding of how the Christian faith took shape and spread from the apostles through the age of Constantine. That's why Hillsdale College has produced a new, free, online course, Ancient Christianity. Professor Kenneth Calvert is your guide through the first 4 centuries of Christianity. He explains a remarkable story of how the Christian faith emerged from its birthplace in a humble Roman outpost to become the Roman Empire's official religion. You can watch the video trailer for this free course and enroll today at hillsdale.edu/Ancient Christianity. Ancient Christianity is perfect for believers or those curious about the history of the Christian faith. Don't miss this opportunity to learn more about the courage and faith of the first Christians. Join us and enroll in our new free online course, Ancient Christianity, at hillsdale.edu/Ancient Christianity today.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Be sure to check out podcast.hillsdale.edu to find all shows on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That includes this one, along with the Hillsdale Dialogues, the Larry Arnn Show, and In Primis, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Ben Whalen. He is Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Whalen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Talking today about Christopher Marlowe, the writer. When was Christopher Marlowe alive? What was happening around this time, especially in literature? What was happening around the time that Marlowe was writing?
Yeah, Marlowe lives in the late 16th century in England. He's an English poet, and so this is right in the middle of what we call the English Renaissance. He lived he was born in 1564 and died in 1593. So the entirety of his life was lived under Queen Elizabeth. This is the Tudor monarchy in England, and for sort of larger common context, it's interesting. Marlowe was born 2 months before William Shakespeare. So his life overlaps perfectly with Shakespeare. Shakespeare, of course, goes on to live till 1616, but Marlowe's a contemporary of Shakespeare, contemporary poet in this wonderful period for poetry and the stage in English literature.
We're going to talk at a separate time about Dr. Faustus. Outside of Dr. Faustus, or a little about Dr. Faustus, but why do we remember Marlowe? What are some of his major works?
Yeah, so primarily we do think of Marlowe as a playwright. So he wrote for the stage, and he wrote, I think Dr. Faustus, of course, is his most well-known, but he wrote a series of different plays, Tamburlaine, parts 1 and 2. He wrote The Jew of Malta, and then he also wrote a comic narrative poem, Hero and Leander, which is really wonderful, somewhat ribald. And then he also wrote, I think, the most popular and well-known lyric poem of the whole period, even more than any of Shakespeare's lyrics, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. So he wrote in a variety of forms and genres, primarily for the stage, but was well regarded and well known during his own lifetime for these various forms.
He's called the father of English tragedy. Why is that so?
Yeah. So, of course, when we think of Shakespeare, we think of the sort of golden period of the stage in Renaissance England. And Shakespeare really started writing immediately after Christopher Marlowe's time on the stage and really Christopher Marlowe's death. In fact, this is interesting. The newest edition of Shakespeare's plays from Oxford University, the New Oxford Shakespeare, gives credit to Christopher Marlowe as a collaborator with Shakespeare on the 3 Henry VI plays, some of Shakespeare's earliest works. So they think that they are convinced that, in fact, Marlowe and Shakespeare were working on these together, which was not uncommon at the period, but that just goes to show the overlap there. So Marlowe is writing just before Shakespeare comes on the scene, really, and then they overlap there. And Marlowe wrote these series of plays with sort of epical scope and massive characters who really all come to destruction in one form or another. So you get this sort of tragic vision with great scope and great passion, and we would think of him as the father of this. There's really nobody writing drama in the period prior to Marlowe that has that sort of scope and depth and that sort of tragic vision. And then he's really the father because, and I delight in thinking about this, thinking of Shakespeare sitting in London watching Dr. Faustus or watching Tamburlaine destroy himself, and thinking about that as Shakespeare is then starting to write some of his great tragedies. So he really had an influence on the whole tradition.
Talking with Dr. Ben Whalen about Christopher Marlowe, you mentioned his plays, his works are distinguished by these overreaching protagonists ending in tragedy. Why was this so new? Why hadn't someone sort of mined this area before?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very interesting one, in part because in the 20th century, for instance, George Steiner, a literary critic, wrote a work called The Death of Tragedy. And he posited, following a line of thought from Nietzsche in Nietzsche's work, The Birth of Tragedy, he followed a line of thought that said, well, it's actually the sort of overarching metaphysical Christian worldview with its theology doesn't really allow for tragedy as it existed in ancient Greece. That there's a sort of a pessimism and a darkness to the view of the universe that man inhabits that the Greeks had, that once you have a redeeming savior and the sort of rewards of the vision of the afterlife that comes with Christianity, that's inherently inimical to tragedy as a genre. And so this part of the line of thought is that when Christianity is really flourishing in the medieval period, tragedy isn't really accessible to this optimistic and ultimately hopeful theology. But then during the Renaissance, things are changing and thought is developing, and I think an opening does occur in which there are certain tragic possibilities. Now, Marlowe is particularly interesting here because we don't know tons about his biography. We have little details here and there, but like Shakespeare, we wish we could know so much more. But one of the things that we do have is that one of Marlowe's fellow playwrights that he lived with and collaborated with in plays, at one point got sent to prison and in front of the Privy Council said that Marlowe was an atheist. And that just becomes an interesting thing when you think, why would Marlowe have this large tragic vision? Well, perhaps he didn't share certain religious convictions that would incline him away from tragedy, but that might open up a vision of, say, the universe as full of meaningless suffering and man's lot in it as a dangerous, precarious one that hovers for a moment before being snuffed out. I mean, that might be something that Marlowe would flirt with intellectually, and that we might see come into part of his vision of the human person in his plays.
Outside of these tragic protagonists, these heroes in Marlowe's work, what are some other themes that are developed through his writings? Yeah, well, he is, even if he does have this tragic vision, he also is certainly interested in religion, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more when we talk about Dr. Faustus. But he is interested in sin, the idea of sin and of transgression. So Tamburlaine, Barabbas, Dr. Faustus, all of them are ambitious and transgress. If you know your Greek myths, you might think of Prometheus, who, say, for a definite good that he sees, transgresses a divine commandment willfully for the good that he sees that as the result of that. So I think Marlowe's characters have he's interested in Promethean overreach, in this bold stretching of the hand towards the forbidden or the too much. And so sin, penance, the will. He's very interested in how it's very interesting to see how his characters will things and how they continue to direct their will towards certain goods, negating or ignoring or at the loss of other goods. So you've told us that we don't know a ton about Marlowe's life, and there's this mystery and intrigue about who he was, what he did. He's alleged to have been a government spy.
Yes.
Do we generally believe this to be true?
Yes. So actually, I am convinced that it is. I think it's a wonderful story here. And by the way, I should just note that Marlowe, he died in 1593. He was only 29 years old, which is just astonishing if you think about his output and his influence on English literature to do all that by the age of 29. But some of the historical evidence we have that suggests that he was a spy for the English government is that he was obviously quite brilliant and went on a scholarship to Cambridge University. And while at Cambridge, it looks like he started hanging out with some of the underground recusant Catholic population, which to various degrees may or may not have been loyal to Queen Elizabeth or in fact plotting an overthrow of the government. There are different conjectures about different figures in those circles, but that Marlowe seemed to be associating with them. And so from the historical records, it looks like the university was not going to issue him his degree. And then the Elizabethan government, in fact, intervened and said, "No, please do. He has been the Queen's good servant. He's provided good service to this government." We don't really know what that means, except that it seems likely that he maybe was infiltrating and informing on the Catholic circles there, rather than being actually sympathetic or working with them, and that had been part of his service. It's also true then that later in his life, after that event, even with these poets in London as he's writing his plays, he definitely associated with different people who we know did have connections to governments and spies. So there's sort of this cloak and dagger element to Marlowe's life, which is just really wonderful. We have the phrase a Renaissance man, a jack of all trades, somebody who does everything. Well, Marlowe really seems to have been. He was a real intellectual. He was a popular playwright, a popular poet, and a spy, a government agent. So he's all over the place.
And died young, as you mentioned, at just 29. And there's some mystery and intrigue around his death, too.
This is one of my favorite things to share with stories because you can't really make it up. You wouldn't imagine a great poet, the father of English tragedy, in fact, dying because he gets stabbed in a bar fight over a bill, which is actually that's what the historical record tells us. He was in a tavern and there was a dispute about the cost, and knives were pulled, and he was killed. The people involved were arrested and then quietly let go by the government just a couple of days later. And we know that several of the people in that room were involved with some of these spy groups. So I think there's also a pretty decent possibility that the dispute about the bill, in fact, is just code or cover up for really he was assassinated, which is maybe a fitting ending. If Marlowe writes about these larger than life tragic heroes, he himself seems to have been larger than life.
All right. I wasn't sure I was going to ask this, but we've come this far. Yeah. There's at least some discussion or questions. Did Marlowe actually write some of Shakespeare's stuff, right?
Yes.
Is that just pure disinformation out there?
It is really. So I'm very intrigued by the scholarship that's suggesting now more and more collaborative work, especially with early Shakespeare. So I think they did know each other.
Right.
They were in the same circles. And I think they probably, the Oxford editors are probably right that they collaborated on the first tetralogy. But Marlowe was dead by 1593, and some of the theories about Marlowe writing Shakespeare's works have to do with Marlowe not actually having died then, and
that's a
leading
whole conversation,
a secret afterlife, or that he wrote all these plays that then Shakespeare sort of put out in his name. And I think that we're so far from plausibility, and there isn't good evidence for that. Marlowe obviously influenced Shakespeare, and Shakespeare learned from him, but we can sort of tell their hands apart. And there's a different poetic voice there for Shakespeare.
Dr. Ben Whalen, Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College, joining us today to talk about Christopher Marlowe, a very interesting figure. Dr. Whalen, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Mollie Hemingway, Senior Journalism Fellow here at Hillsdale College, Bishop Robert Barron, who gave our 2023 commencement address at Hillsdale, and Ben Whalen from Hillsdale's English Department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.